I think that there's a very weak understanding of war that goes on. War is often seen as battles. So that when we talked about the opening of the war in 2022, people were talking about, oh, a great battle of Kyiv, as if the Russians would swoop down, they'd fight this engagement, they'd take Kyiv, and the war would be over. It's a weird kind of short war myth that crops up regularly. People think wars will always be short and decisive when they never are, hardly ever are. But then we have this idea that you'll fight a battle and the battles will decide a war. Well, wars are very rarely, if ever, decided by battles. They're decided by constant struggles over force generation and force adaptation. So I think there's an intellectual problem, but there's also a systemic problem. The analytical community is very protective of itself. It tends to be Russianists. It tends to be people who built their career saying the Russian military is really big and strong, and therefore the UK MOD and the US DOD have to fund to fight this great Russian steamroller. And they simply had you might say, a vested interest in supporting each other and having a false view of what the Russian military was.
Away from the battlefield, it's interesting to look, and I know that you're very interested in the air campaigns, both by Ukraine and Russia. And you describe Ukraine's air war as sporadic until now. What has constrained it to be such, and what has it achieved so far?
Well, Ukraine has had to basically make up a ranged force. It didn't have it to start the war. It didn't have the ability to do ranged fires on Russia. Russia had large numbers of missile stocks with which it could attack Ukraine. So Ukraine has had to develop its own ranged force. Now, it did receive some help from the British and the French at one point, Storm Shadows and Scalps, and the U.S. reluctantly eventually gave the Ukrainians ATACMS. However, they've not been able to use Western weapons to run a real range campaign. And by the way, I don't know if you saw the story of a few days ago. The US DOD has basically been stomping on that for a while now. Not only can the Ukrainians not use US weapons, they can't use the Storm Shadows and Scalps to attack Russian targets because the US won't let them do that. So with Western weapons off the table, the only way the Ukrainians can run a real range campaign is through what they have developed. They're now starting to get only now to develop, you might say, the range of systems with the firepower, with the accuracy. And by the way, we still don't know if they have that to run a truly ranged campaign in the kind of way the Russians have run a ranged campaign against them. So we'll have to see whether these new Ukrainian systems, particularly the Flamingo missile, work as effectively as many Ukrainians hope. If they do that, they can finally run something that is sustained. So far, it's not been sustained because they haven't had the equipment.
Yeah, I want to ask you a bit more about the Flamingo in a moment. But over the past week, the Ukraine has successfully and repeatedly attacked Russia's oil industry. What effect has that had? And do you believe you say we have to see if they can sustain this and develop it? Do you think they will? And the aim is to cripple Russia's oil industry.
Well, this is, from the Ukrainian point of view, a very heartening development. They had started attacking Russian refineries years ago, but then they'd attack a few refineries and stop, and give the Russians time to rebuild the infrastructure. The whole point about a ranged air campaign is you have to keep it up. It's much harder to do than people think. It's not like dropping a bomb, destroying a target. Aha, we've done this. Because targets can be repaired. There are alternate ways you can move production. So until recently, the attacks on Russian refineries have been, as I tried to say, sporadic. There have been one or two attacks, they stopped, one or two attacks, they stopped. More recently, the signs are the Ukrainians are really focusing on oil refineries. Which is it's a really effective tool for them to do because it has a number of spillover effects. One, of course, it will hurt the Russian economy. Right now, fuel prices seem to be rising. It's not that easy to get fuel in certain parts of Russia. But it will also reduce the amount of oil that the Russians can sell, which is their key weapon in the war, is getting money from the sale of oil to put into their war industry. So if the Ukrainians can attack Russian oil production and seriously damage it. There's some estimate now that actually they've damaged it, not yet 20%, but maybe 20% of production seems to be hit. So that will hit both domestic economy and Russia's international ability to raise money. So one would think, with the signs that we see, that attacking oil is going to be an increasing part of Ukraine's future.
And is that why you argue that a strategic air campaign could end up being the most important of the last few years for Ukraine?
Absolutely, because the battlefield, what we see with these armies is sort of what we've seen now for a while, and it's hard to see that changing. Yes, there's tactical adaptation on the battlefield, but neither side has been able to move forward in any fast, aggressive, take a lot of territory kind of way, because it seems to be that defensive firepower immediately on the battlefield is so strong that you can't mass vehicles, you can't build up supply dumps, you can't do the kinds of things that you would normally do to have an exploitation. So the way to change the course of the war is probably not going to be bashing your army against the other side's army on the front line. It will be by destroying the ability of one of the side or the other to rebuild its military force, resupply it, and keep it going. And that is why I think the range campaign will become increasingly important.
So where might this FP5 Flamingo cruise missile fit into all of this? Just tell us a bit more about it to start with.
Well, the big thing about the Flamingo that is different than any Ukrainian system to this point is it's a very heavy weapon. In other words, it carries, I think, a 1-ton payload. Whereas if you've looked at earlier Ukrainian drones and the long-range drones they've put out, they're quite simple weapons with relatively small payloads. The early ones even looked like some Cessnas, small planes that carried bombs and would fly into a building. If they can get the Flamingo to work and they can build it in mass, these are the key things, they will then have the kind of weapon that can do far more devastating damage to a target. I.e., we don't just have a small fire, it'll have a very big fire. It will destroy a lot of equipment. A few Flamingos hitting an oil refinery would do a lot of damage, one would say, compared to a larger number of smaller drones. So that's why it's important. It's a heavier weapon than they've had before. It is potentially more sophisticated and it could be more accurate. Accuracy is going to be a very important point. We don't know how accurate it will be. But it's more along the lines of the kinds of weapons that Western countries have, like the German Tauruses, American JASSMs, which they haven't given to Ukraine because they didn't want Ukraine to have them. And the Ukrainians have said, okay, well, we'll try and make our own.
We'll get back to your video shortly, but first, many of you right now will be watching the show on your phone, tablet or laptop, completely unaware that this very second someone could be accessing your device and stealing your data. Using the internet without private internet access, VPN, is like letting Facebook post your diary. Your friends and family can read all your dirty secrets. A virtual private network, or VPN for short, is an app that hides your IP address and safeguards your internet connection through an encrypted tunnel. It shields your digital life from those eyes who are looking to exploit your private information. Whenever you connect to the internet on a public Wi-Fi network at airports, coffee shops, friends' houses, or even at your own home, your data is at risk of being stolen. Your device is transmitting a great amount of information out into the open, which can be viewed by various different entities before reaching the intended website, such as your ISP, government censors, advertising companies, and more. Hackers on the same network can easily steal your personal data. With PIA, you're protected. But there's more. With PIA, you can access all your usual streaming services, including Netflix, Amazon Prime, and Disney+, even if you're outside your own region. All you need to do is open the app, select a server from 91 countries, and just like that, you're digitally there. And it's not just for fun. With recent legislation, more and more content is being restricted. PIA allows you to access the content and news that you want to watch. And with one PIA subscription, you can protect an unlimited number of devices, so that's the whole family covered. Follow the link in the description or scan the QR code on the screen now to receive a massive 86% discount, making it just £1.57 per month. There's a 30-day money-back guarantee, and to top it off, you'll receive 4 additional months for free. Head to piavpn.com now and take control of your digital life.
And of course, they can't be governed by restrictions on where and when they can use them.
Yep, U.S. is learning a lesson here, and European states are learning lessons. If you say to the Ukrainians, "Well, we don't want we don't want you to have these weapons because we don't necessarily like what you're going to do with them," well, then the Ukrainians will make their own, and then you can't influence them. And I think we're about to see that.
And how soon do you think we will see or know whether or not they can produce these new cruise missiles in high quantities of numbers?
Well, what we know is what they've said, and we always have to take that with a grain of salt. That they're obviously now not they're just starting up production. The rates that we've talked about, that they've talked about, is one a day right now. By October, the Ukrainians have said they'd like to be at 7 a day, which is getting up there. I mean, that's still not a high rate of production, but it's a decent rate of production. Zelensky said in an evening address that he's talking about mass production, basically early 2026. I would think you would need at least 500 stockpiled before you could start a real ranged campaign, because you can't have just a small number and stop. If you're going to need hundreds stockpiled and then new production online to be able to run the campaign you want. So when could the campaign start? If they are telling the truth about their production, it could start late fall of 2025.